Easter time, the holiest time of the year, but also the time when dark forces and magic are at work. It was Easter in the monastery of Drimnagh. A young man from the village was working hard. His job was to make these big feasts in the monastery. He did this so well every year, so people used to call this young man for the Abbot of Drimnagh. Now, he had been working hard for 3 days to prepare the feast. He was exhausted, but satisfied. Now, tomorrow was the big day, but for now he could go home to his beloved wife and have a meal and a good sleep. So the young man, the Abbot of Drimnagh, he took his sword and he left the monastery. But walking through the village and saying hello to his friends and neighbors, he suddenly got a feeling he needed a bit of a longer walk, so he left the village and just took this pathway outside. And he was approaching the great mound outside Drimnagh. And little did he think about what people said about that mound, that it was inhabited by the fairies. Ah, nice evening. Spring. It was a bit tired to be true after all this work. So, overviewing the village, he sat down for a while for a rest. And he put the sword to his side and he just had to lie down and close his eyes for a moment only. And he fell to sleep. Dreaming the strangest dreams of arms dressed in silver coming up from the ground, touching him, caring for him. It was already dark. His wife must be worried. He needed to go home quickly now. So he stretched for his sword. But there was no sword, but a spindle. Strange. He happened to touch his head and found that his hair was plaited. And his beard was gone. And he looked at himself and he found that he was dressed in a woman's clothes. And in a moment of horror, he put his hand between his thighs. Goodness! He found that he was no more a he but a she. What was going on here? What could he do now? In that moment he saw a strange old woman standing there. in a dress of silver. She had hollow eyes, long grey hair, scary face. And she said, "Oh my, what is a young girl like you doing out in the darkness with no protection?" And the old hag was gone. And the Abbot of Drimnagh, what could he do? What could she do? She couldn't go home to her wife in this state. The only thing she could do was turn Drimnagh her back and started to walk in the other direction, into the darkness of the night. But after dark, there is light. Morning was coming. Young birds singing. People coming out from their farms to work on the fields. She was walking north. She could see the monastery of crumbling. And from there, a young man was coming out, approaching her. "Young lady, may I walk with you?" "Why, yes." He was nice, he was fair, he was sweet and good to her. They talked and they walked. And after a while he said, "Young lady, you must be tired. Don't you need a rest? We could sit down in the high grass over here." And she said yes. That morning, the abbot found out about pleasures that she had never dreamed about in her former life as a man. And the young man, he said, "My lady, I do like you. I wish you would be my wife." And she was, of course, a bit surprised. This was going a bit quick. But on the other hand, the pleasures that this man could give to her, and the sweetness of himself, and also the fact that he was offering her a home now that she had lost her own back in Drimnagh. Well, she said yes. And so they walked back to Crumlin, and he had a very nice house because he was the chief administrator of the monastery of Crumlin. And so they were married, and a new life started for the abbot. Oh, there was a lot to learn about women's work. Were they really working so hard like this all the time? He didn't know before. My goodness. But on the other hand, the pleasures of being a woman. And yes, of course, the consequences of the pleasures. The Abbot of Drimnagh gave one day birth to a child, but that was just the first. There was a second, there was a third, and so on, until they had 7 children in that house. A house filled with life and joy and laughter. So years had passed by, when one day there came a letter from Drimnagh to the chief administrator of the monastery in Crumlin. Wouldn't he and his family be so kind and come and visit them over the Easter time? Because they were going to have a new great feast there. And of course the husband was very eager to go there. And the wife, the abbot, had to think about this twice. Going back to Drimnagh, where she once had been a young man. Would she dare to? But on the other hand, she was very curious. How was it over there now? She consented. And so they prepared, and they dressed up, and one day they could leave Crumlin to walk the road to Drimnagh. First walked the husband with the youngest child on his arm. And after 6 children in a row. And last came the abbot, the wife, proudly watching her big family. And they walked, and it was a warm day, walked for hours along the road. She was growing tired. And they were approaching Drimnagh. And the mound of Drimnagh. She was a bit behind the others now. She could see them crossing the hill. Oh, she was tired. And she was climbing the mound herself. Oh. When she came to the top, they were gone already. Down to the village. Oh, she had to rest a bit. Just sit down for a moment. Oh. Maybe just lie down for a tiny bit of moment. Maybe close the eyes just for a second. And she fell to sleep, dreaming the strangest dreams. Oh, it was dark already. her family. The children must be worried. She needed to run down to the village now, to the feast. So she sat up and happened to touch something in the grass. A sword. Quite familiar sword. Her hair was changed. She was wearing a man's clothes. And in a moment of horror, goodness! Oh Lord Almighty! How can you let these things happen to me over and over again? Oh, my life is in a real mess now. What could she do now? He? Well, his children needed him. So he hurried down the mound and into Drimnagh. The feast was already going on, and there was his family. The children came running up to him, and they stopped and they said, "Mother, what is that in your face?" He had a beard. And here came the husband, saying, "My dearest dear, you have changed." Well, the abbot started with trembling voice to tell the whole story that you have just heard to the husband and to the children and to the crowd now standing all around them. And while telling the story, he started to weep, looking at his husband that he loved so deeply, who had given him such pleasures of life. What will become of them now? And over there in the crowd, his wife, that he had abandoned years ago. She was standing there with confusion in her face, with sorrow, but also hope. Where did he belong now? The night passed. There was a new morning. And the houses of Drimnagh opened. And the elders came out, all walking up to the monastery to have a gathering, to talk about this strange case and how to judge in this matter. Well, they agreed that everything must have been a trick that the fairies had made to the poor abbot. But what should they do about this problem that he now was married to a woman and a man? Imagine the penalties in these medieval days for such things. Well, they came up with a solution. Since he obviously now was a man and not a woman, his womanhood had taken place in another kind of life. He couldn't be blamed. He was not that woman anymore. They decided. And they said that his marriage with a husband must be cancelled. And that was a sad thing for the two of them. But his marriage with a wife was reinstalled, and that was a good thing for them. He got his job back, organized feasts here at the monastery. But what about the children? It was decided that the husband could take 4 of the children back to Crumlin, but the abbot, he could keep 3 of them with him and his wife. And that is why that day he could walk home with his wife and with 3 children that insisted in calling him mother. And from that day to the end of his life, he remained best friends with his former husband.